Picture the moment before everything you thought you knew about medieval Africa gets dismantled completely, not gently revised, not politely updated, but demolished down to the foundation and rebuilt from raw historical material that most Western education systems have never once asked you to examine. Because somewhere beneath the modern Sudanese desert, beneath sand dunes that swallow entire cathedral complexes the way the ocean swallows ships, beneath a landscape that the modern world has associated almost exclusively with crisis and poverty and political instability, there are walls, and those walls are painted, and the paintings on those walls depict kings in robes of Byzantine purple receiving the blessing of archangels, rendered in a pigment so vivid, so electrically alive, even after 1,000 years of burial, that when archaeologists first uncovered them in the 1960s at a site called Faras, a site that was about to be permanently submerged beneath the waters of Lake Nasser by the construction of the Aswan High Dam, the excavation team worked in rotating shifts around the clock for weeks because they knew the water was coming, and they could not stop it. And every fresco they failed to remove in time would be gone forever. And what they found in those desperate weeks of excavation was not a footnote. It was not a curiosity. It was the visual record of a civilization of staggering sophistication and confidence. A civilization that had been Christian for longer than most European nations had existed, that had resisted the military expansion of the early Islamic Caliphates through a combination of military effectiveness and diplomatic brilliance, that forced the most powerful empire of the 7th century to negotiate rather than conquer, that had produced theology and architecture and manuscript culture and royal iconography of genuine world historical significance, and that had been so completely erased from the standard narrative of medieval world history that most educated people in the 21st century, people who can name the Plantagenet kings of England and the doges of Venice and the Holy Roman emperors, have never heard the word Makuria, have never heard the word Nobatia, have never heard the word Alodia, the 3 great Christian kingdoms of medieval Nubia, and that erasure, that specific and comprehensive disappearance of an entire chapter of African Christian civilization from the consciousness of the educated Western world, is not an accident, it is not merely an oversight, it is a consequence of historical choices about what gets remembered and what gets buried. And the question scorching at the center of this story, the question those painted kings in their Byzantine purple are still asking from the museum walls where their frescoes now hang in Warsaw and Khartoum, is why, and what the answer to why reveals about the stories we tell ourselves about the medieval world and who was allowed to participate in it. The story of Christianity in Nubia begins earlier than most people realize, and arrives from a direction that complicates the tidy narrative of Christianity as fundamentally a Mediterranean and subsequently European phenomenon. Because the Nile Valley had been in intimate cultural and commercial contact with the Eastern Mediterranean world since a period measured not in centuries but in millennia. And when Christianity began spreading outward from its Palestinian origins in the 1st century of the Common Era, it moved south along the Nile with a speed and a rootedness that suggests it was falling into already prepared cultural soil. And by the 6th century, the Nubian kingdoms of Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia had adopted Christianity as their official religion through a process that the Byzantine chronicles describe with a competitive urgency that tells you everything about the geopolitical stakes involved, because both Constantinople promoting the Chalcedonian theological position and Alexandria promoting the Miaphysite position were simultaneously sending missionaries to the Nubian courts, essentially racing each other to secure the theological and therefore political allegiance of kingdoms that controlled the Upper Nile and therefore controlled access to the African interior. And the Nubian kings played these competing missionary embassies with a sophistication that suggests they understood perfectly well that theology was a proxy for geopolitics, and that their choice of doctrinal allegiance would shape their relationship with one Mediterranean power or another for generations. And they ultimately aligned predominantly with the Miaphysite tradition of Alexandria, a choice that separated them theologically from Constantinople and later from Rome, and that has contributed to their invisibility in the Western historical tradition, which has tended to treat Chalcedonian orthodoxy as the default Christian perspective from which all others are deviations. And then the 7th century arrived, and with it, the Islamic conquests, and with those conquests, a pressure that would have destroyed most kingdoms in most circumstances. But Nubia was not most kingdoms, and the circumstances it created in response to that pressure are among the most remarkable in the medieval record. In 641 AD, Arab forces completed their conquest of Egypt and stood at the border of Nubia looking south, and what they found there stopped them. And this is extraordinary, because these were forces that had just destroyed the Persian Empire, that had torn the richest provinces from Byzantine control, that operated with a military and ideological momentum so overwhelming that the historians of the period struggled to find adequate language for it. And they tried Nubia. They sent forces south into the Nubian territory of Nobatia, in what the Arabic sources call the first Ghazwa into Nubia, and they were repulsed. And the detail that the Arabic chronicles record about why they were repulsed is one of the most startling military details of the entire early medieval period. The Nubian archers, the Arabic sources say, with a specificity that reads like genuine traumatic memory, were so accurate with their composite bows that they targeted the eyes of their opponents, specifically, and the Arabic nickname for the Nubian warriors that emerges from this period, Rumat al-Hadaq, which translates approximately as pupil smiters or eye smiters, carries in it the specific horror of an army that encountered a military skill it had not anticipated and could not easily counter. And in 652 AD, after further inconclusive engagements, the Arab governor of Egypt signed with the Nubian king of Makuria an agreement that the Arabic sources call the Baqt, a treaty, a negotiated settlement between the expanding Islamic Caliphate and a Nubian kingdom, that had demonstrated with extreme physical clarity that it was not going to be absorbed the way Egypt had been absorbed. And the Baqt is one of the most remarkable documents in medieval diplomatic history, an agreement that specified annual exchanges of goods, that established protocols for the treatment of travelers and merchants crossing the border, that recognized Makurian sovereignty over its territory, and that held, with various renegotiations and periodic violations on both sides, for roughly 600 years. 6 centuries during which the Christian kingdoms of Nubia maintained their independence while the Islamic world surrounded them on every side, and during which the Nile Valley became one of the most complex and genuinely pluralist frontier zones in the medieval world. Here is where historical honesty requires us to complicate the narrative that the modern rediscovery of Nubian Christianity sometimes generates, because there is a version of this story circulating in certain cultural and political contexts that presents the Nubian Christian kingdoms as a kind of pure and heroic African Christian civilization, locked in existential resistance against Arab Islamic expansion. A narrative that is emotionally satisfying and politically useful in several contemporary contexts, but that is historically incomplete in ways that matter. Because the reality of the Nubian kingdoms across their several centuries of existence was considerably more entangled with the Islamic world than the resistance narrative admits. The relationship between Nubia and the Arab Muslim powers to the north and east was not simply military confrontation. It was trade. It was cultural exchange. It was the movement of people and goods and ideas across a frontier that was simultaneously a religious boundary and a commercial highway. Arab merchants lived in Nubian cities. Nubian Christian pilgrims traveled through Muslim territory to reach Jerusalem. The kings of Makuria maintained diplomatic relationships with the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo that included genuine political alliance against common enemies. And the Nubian court itself absorbed significant Arabic linguistic and administrative influence over time, so that by the later period of the kingdoms, official documents were being produced in both Greek and Arabic, and the iconography of royal power was blending Byzantine Christian visual traditions with forms borrowed from the Islamic world. And then there's the question of the kingdom's own internal politics, which were no less brutal or complicated than any other medieval state. The succession disputes that periodically convulsed Makuria were genuinely violent. The relationship between the monarchy and the church hierarchy was perpetually contested, and the treatment of enslaved people in the Nubian economy requires honest examination because the Baqt itself specified an annual delivery of enslaved people from Nubia to Arab Egypt, meaning that the treaty that preserved Nubian independence was partly financed by the enslavement and transfer of human beings, whose own names and stories and suffering are almost entirely absent from the chronicles that celebrate the kingdom's survival. What finally ended the Nubian Christian kingdoms was not a single dramatic military conquest, but a process of slow dissolution across the 13th and 14th centuries driven by a combination of factors so interlocking and mutually reinforcing that historians still debate their relative weight. The Mongol destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 paradoxically destabilized the Nubian political environment by eliminating the counterweight that had helped maintain the balance of power in the region. The Mamluk Sultanate that rose to power in Egypt was more aggressively expansionist toward Nubia than previous Egyptian governments had been. Internal succession crises in Makuria became increasingly entangled with Egyptian political intervention, as Mamluk-backed claimants contested the throne, and gradual but persistent demographic change as Arab and Bedouin groups migrated into Nubian territory over generations slowly altered the ethnic and cultural composition of the population in ways that eroded the social foundations of the church and the royal institutions that had defined Nubian civilization. And by the early 14th century, the kingdom of Makuria had effectively ceased to function as a coherent political entity, its last documented king appearing in the historical record in 1315, and the southernmost kingdom of Alodia persisted somewhat longer but met a similar end. And the Cathedral of Faras sank slowly into the sand that would preserve it for 7 centuries, until the archaeologists came with their desperate brushes and their racing clocks and the floodwaters behind them. And today, the frescoes of Faras hang in the National Museum of Sudan in Khartoum, and in the National Museum in Warsaw, which received a portion of them as acknowledgement of the Polish archaeological mission that led the excavation. And the Sudan itself is a nation that has spent much of its recent history in conditions of civil war and political crisis and humanitarian catastrophe that make the contemplation of medieval cathedral frescoes feel almost obscenely remote from present reality. And yet, the question that those painted kings in their Byzantine purple are asking from their museum walls is precisely the question that the present crisis makes most urgent. The question of what it means to belong to a history that the world has decided not to remember, to be the descendant of kingdoms that built cathedrals and negotiated treaties with caliphates and produced art of genuine transcendent beauty, and were then written out of the story of a human civilization so completely that the rediscovery of a single submerged cathedral complex in the 1960s came as a genuine shock to the academic establishment. And the final question, the one that should follow you out of this video and into whatever you do next, is not about medieval Nubia at all. It is about the machinery of historical memory itself, about who operates that machinery and whose interests it serves and what else, what other painted kings and what other buried rooms might be waiting beneath the sand of a world that has already decided it knows everything worth knowing about the past.